Well, welcome to Healthy Chats with the Doc. I am in Park City, Utah, my ski sweater on. I know you Californians are probably at the beach, but today we're so excited to have Dr. Moira Fitzpatrick talk to us about genetic testing. I was telling Joe there's nobody better to be on this call to talk about genetic testing and functional medicine. So, Doctor, thank you so much for being on here and to talk about genetic testing. I guess let's start with, and I was going to love your answer. Why is genetic testing so important to your overall health?
Well, I think your genetics really are the foundation. And if we know what your genetics are, and we can take a look at different mutations, and what we're specifically looking at is single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs. And that's just a fancy word for the most frequent type of mutation. And that's like a spelling mistake. And the reason we want to look at it is because we can go around it. We don't just look at genetics to look at genetics, but we see that how it can affect different symptoms you may have. Like you may have fatigue, you may have migraines, you may be depressed, you may be at risk for cancer. So what we can do is by taking a look at your SNPs, your mutations, we can see what's going on from a nutritional perspective and help make sure that biochemical pathway is working well. And I think people are most familiar with the MTHFR. And it's really important to know that, yes, that's important, but unless you know what's going on with the other SNPs, you could actually cause a little bit of harm. So when we look at MTHFR, what that means is if you have a mutation, like heterozygous means you inherited one mutation from one parent, and homozygous means you inherited a mutation from both parents. And what happens is the whole enzyme is slowed down. And if that enzyme is slowed down, then it decreases your ability to make or activate folate. Activate folate is methylating folate. And so you say, well, why don't you just measure that? Well, you can't. We don't know how to measure methylfolate or activated folate. But why is it important? And I think it's really important because it has to do with being able to methylate folate. It has to do with being able to synthesize DNA and repair DNA. And that's so important for all of us, and particularly important in cancer patients. It's also involved in neurotransmitters. Now, we have known for a long time now that Deplin, which is a form of folate, methylfolate, helps your medications work better significantly. So if you are depressed, if you're anxious, if you're on medications, and you know what your genetic predisposition is, you can feel a whole lot better. And then when I think about
you mentioned a couple of things, Doctor, I'd like to go back to because it kind of relates, especially with the MTHFR, because that was kind of the first one that I think 6-7 years ago, SpectraCell started testing, and now LabCorp and Quest, everyone's doing it. And you also said that you could possibly do harm. So one of the things I wanted to talk about was the interplay between the different SNPs, because I think that that's a critically important aspect that you and I and everybody in epigenetics has learned, and that you can actually make people more anxious if you take the wrong type of B vitamin, for example. And that's the problem with actually going on the internet and just getting Dr. Google. So do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So let's say, as we're looking at all these different SNPs, let's say you have a COMT homozygous. What does that mean? Well, that means it can really slow down your ability to clear dopamine. Dopamine is that feel-good neurotransmitter, but if you get too much dopamine, that can cause irritation and anxiety. So when you have that particular SNP and you add methylation, then that increases your anxiety and makes everything worse. And so it's important to know not just the MTHFR, MTHFR, but also what's going on with the COMT. And, when I think about it, one of the most important enzymes, one of the most important SNPs also is that CBS. And that has to do with your ability to detox. You can overwhelm your whole detoxification systems by just having a homozygous inherited mutation from each of your parents to CBS. And lots of people that have that CBS mutation are intolerant to alcohol. Some of the other SNPs along that pathway may predispose you to fatty liver. So it's really important to know all of the different SNPs and how they work together.
That's really important. I think that was one of the interesting things we learned with the IRB study we did. Remember back when we were just looking at the MTHFR and, the Levita had the liquid form of methyl tetrahydrofolic for in the injections and the study that we did. And I think that's when we began learning about how important the interplay was. And so I think what I hear you saying is genetics are super important to your health and that you really should not just go off the internet. You should find a doctor who understands kind of the foundational metabolic pathways and those types of things. I know that you use the patient user guide a lot that Epigenetics put together with the gears and those types of things. So how do you explain that interplay to your patients? Because I know you're so good.
Well, one of the ways that I do that is I look at the gears and they get how all the gears are connected. And all those chartreuse hexagons are really enzymes. And what we're looking at are the mutations to the enzymes. It's slow the enzyme down or speed it up. And so then we take a look at, we usually start with MTHFR, and then we take a look at, what's going on with COMT and how does that affect MTHFR? And then how does that relate to the green gear, which has to do with methionine? What do your B12 levels look like? Are you able to methylate B12? Maybe methylated B12 isn't really good for you and you need hydroxy or adenosine B12. How can we get all these gears going together so that they're working well? And so one of the great ways to explain it, and this just happened this morning, I had someone come in with a very high homocysteine level. Well, he happens to have a MTHFR, but he also had very low B12. So that tells me, okay, so that connection between that folate gear, that folate pathway and the methionine pathway isn't working really well. So why? What are the genetics? And then the other thing we have to ask is what's going on gastrointestinally that maybe he's got low B12 because of that. So we look at that. And then the other thing that we also take a look at that's particularly prevalent right now, or was during the pandemic, is we look at VDR. VDR is an enzyme that stands for vitamin D receptor. Are you able to absorb vitamin D? And if you're not, then you probably need higher amounts of vitamin D in order to support your immune system. Or if you're a woman and you've got osteopenia or osteoporosis, you may need extra vitamin D. So the one thing I do want to...
Yeah, go ahead.
The one thing I do want to say is you're not going to look at it in a vacuum either. You're going to look at it in relationship to your labs. What does your vitamin D say? And the genetics will give you that information. Well, you need vitamin D because you have a VDR mutation. You're not able to really absorb your vitamin D.
So in regards to that, Bob, Dr. Fitzpatrick, what we're looking at is the whole person, right? I think your functional medicine looks at the whole person care. So you do other labs, you look at other biomarkers, you look at your genetics, and then you also look at how the patient or the person, what kind of symptoms they might be experiencing, correct?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So in regards to that, what we're looking at, and I think you've described, it's really important to look at genetics and have a doctor that understands it. I think the other thing that the reason I love the term epigenetics so often is that, genes are not your destiny, right? Because what you're talking about is, okay, you were born with, this genetic predisposition that may, if not known or not looked at or not treated, however you want to describe it, could cause some health issues. But the good news is, like you just said, it's like, oh, you're low on B, and you might need some vitamin D, that your interventions, not only with supplements and nutraceuticals, but also with diet and lifestyle, can really help address your predispositions. But it doesn't mean that just because, I have the APO4, I'm going to get Alzheimer's, for example.
That's right. So one of the things that I do, let's say somebody does have APOE4, that usually freaks people out. And so we talk about, is that a predisposition to Alzheimer's? Well, it is. But there's so much that can be done around Alzheimer's. One of the things they're talking about now is Alzheimer's is almost like a type 3 diabetes. And what is the worst thing you can do for the brain? Feed it sugar. So what does that APOE4 really mean? It just means that when you're looking at the brain, there's clumps of amyloid plaques. And now we have even more testing. We can look at, what is happening in your environment that's predisposing you, in addition to your genetics, to Alzheimer's disease. And we can look at things like environmental toxins. We can look at pathogens. We can look at foods that, for example, are so similar to amyloid beta that there can sometimes be a molecular mimicry, so that food is causing problems in your brain. So there's so much we can do based on the genetics, based on your lifestyle, sometimes supplementation, and lots of times in terms of the APOE4, avoiding certain environmental toxins. Another one
go ahead. Yeah.
Another one that I wanted to bring up, because there's something you can really do for it in terms of dietary, is that the NOS. And for those of you in the cold, do you have a predisposition to have cold hands and cold feet and cold nose? Is it hard for you to get circulation into your periphery? And that may be related to a particular SNP, the NOS. And sometimes, that can predispose you not only to Raynaud's, to vascular insufficiency, to brain fog. People wonder, well, why do I have brain fog? Well, I'm going to check this SNP, because are you really getting circulation to your brain? And if not, we can do something about it. And so,
well, I think the other thing is, go ahead. Sorry.
But what's critical, in addition to, we could add a supplement, but exercise. Exercise increases circulation to the periphery, and so do foods like beets and leafy greens and berries and pomegranate and cherries, all the good fruits and vegetables.
Yeah, and I think that, I had some high cholesterol about a year and a half ago, and I remember it's like, oh God, then they go, don't you, as a doctor, I, need to tell you that you should be on statins. And I'm like, oh my God, no. So, I did obviously the diet and the lifestyle, and, I dropped 20 pounds and, I did the kind of things you need to do. So like when you talk about, lifestyle and Alzheimer's being, type 3 diabetes and those things, you do have to look at your body as, it's a very sophisticated machine, and it's kicking things. And like one of the most interesting things I think we started seeing doing, working with doctors like you in the functional medicines is, even the estrogen stacking in the transsulfuration pathway, since you do so many hormones, is like, the reality is that we may be preventing breast cancer, with some of these kinds of things. And that's why genetics is super important. And that's where, again, you don't have to worry about having a transsulfuration pathway issue, because you can work around that. And I think that's probably what I get so most excited about with the work you do.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and then the other part of that, and I see a lot of cancer patients, particularly with reproductive cancers, is I look at that SAMe, SAH ratio. So and that affects 3 different pathways: the MTHFR, the methionine, and the transsulfuration. And so what becomes really important is that SAMe, which is the universal donor of methyl groups. So what's so good about a methyl group? Well, a methyl group added to estrogen breakdown products or estrogen metabolism protects you from reproductive cancers. And every time SAMe gives away a methyl group, you got to get it back. And that's where it becomes really important for us to work with all 3 of those pathways to make sure that you're making SAMe.
Yeah. And I do think that is interesting. I know we're over time already, but I think that the fact that you do work with a lot of cancer patients is really worth talking about, because you do look at the genetics. I know oncology and precision medicine has really driven personalized medicine and genetic testing. Just at your level, can you talk about how you work with genetics is different than an oncologist might, because you're both using genetics, but you're using them in a different way?
So when I'm working with somebody who's got cancer after their conventional treatment, and after I've supported them in decreasing whatever the side effects are, then we have to take a look at, what does the soil look like? And I mean, what is the general health of the individual? And this is where we go back and we take a look at what are the genetics? How can we go around those different SNPs to make sure that you have optimal amounts of the nutrients that you need? What's going on in terms of what you're eating? How is your digestion? And I think about it, the core of all disease is really digestion. And so we're taking a look at digestion, genetics, nutrient sufficiency, how you're living your life. What is your health consciousness? What is the way that you're thinking, and how can we support you in thinking in a more life-affirming way? So there's a whole transformation that happens after somebody has finished their cancer treatments.
Yeah. Well, doctor, we went over, but it's such an important topic, and I can't recommend people find you and get an appointment with you. How would you like them to contact you if they're interested in making an appointment?
So they can call my office. That's 760-704-8148. And they can go to my website, drmoirafitzpatrick.com.
Great. Well, I encourage everybody who's interested in this topic to make an appointment with Dr. Moira Fitzpatrick. She's been a forerunner in this, and she's really an expert in genetics and functional medicine and whole person healthcare. So again, doctor, thank you so very much. You have a wonderful time. If I get back out on the slopes, I for sure will this weekend. I'll snap a picture for you. It's beautiful.
Wonderful. And I just want to thank you for the quality of the genetic testing that you provided at the genetics. I really appreciate that. And that's really important to me as a practitioner.
Oh, you're welcome. And I'm super excited that the new Tempus tests will be ready. I think Joe was saying next week we're going to be ready to ship those out. So I'm very excited about it. It will cut the turn time down to 3 weeks. So that's important too.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yes. All right, Doc. Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.